welcome to Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room. We're going to continue Greenlight by SerenMusafir today. Before we get started, though, I want to give a big shout out to @BeachyReads on TikTok. She shared this podcast with her followers, so she's got some great Dramione recommendations and overall good book reviews, so go check her out for a follow on TikTok. And let's get started with Chapter 6. Greenlight, Chapter 6. I have prepared myself for revelations of my soul while I seek enlightenment. Is my soul deserving of this pursuit of light? I do not believe the oasis will be found simply because I seek it. I am not blind to my past and the sins I've committed, nor do I forget the penance for those sins in this life might not be enough. As such, I must wonder if this path that I have chosen has an end. If I choose the light, will the light choose me? Am I worthy of Noor? Sophia Aljabar, 1915. Noor. Hermione looks up from Sophia's diary and gazes through her window. The word is repeated so many times throughout the diary, she can't help but feel there's another meaning to it, other than the reference to the cave itself. She feels a cramp in her leg and tries to adjust herself, making sure Lena's head on her shoulder doesn't drop. They make a stop 3 hours into the ride for stretching their legs, and Hermione follows Lena out of the vehicle, passing the bag with the oranges to Mina to share with the others. They've chosen to stop by a large green expanse near a cliff that looks out to the forest below. Most of the crew stand around talking under the shades of the palm trees. Hermione's head turns, seeking out a blonde head. Malfoy's sitting in the Jeep that's parked a little further away from the rest. He's in the front passenger seat, the car door open wide, legs stretched out wide in front of him. His head grazes the top of the door. She twists a little closer and realizes he's hunched over his journal, a quill working its way across the page. The journal looks thicker than before, and Hermione suspects he's charming pages into it. He's not writing, she thinks. The strokes are too small and fixated on a single part of the page, with the journal angled to its side so that it's lying horizontally across his knee. She watches him rub his thumb across the page, smudging the ink and blowing gently to dry the splotch. His long, pale fingers curve around the quill as he grips it and works again on his strokes. His blonde fringe flutters across his forehead, and he absent-mindedly brushes it away when it falls into his eyes. He jerks his head when it falls right back into his face, and Hermione's hands twitch reflexively, as if aching to hold his hair back for him. His arm defensively covers the page, even though no one is nearby, and the act alone makes her want to go up to him and take the journal. She even spends a few seconds thinking of using Accio, just so she can see what he's doing. Instead, she turns away to make her way closer to the cliff. The edge of the cliff is barred off with a tottering metal fence. It's quieter with the trees just beyond, the laughter and voices of the group distant behind her. She places a hand against the trunk of a large tree towering beside her and closes her eyes, listening intently to the whispers of the dancing branches and swishing leaves. "Hermione, my love, you're going to have to let go now," her father told her, arms raised toward where she sat on the branch. "I can't," she whimpered, eyes wide, and tightened her hold on the tree's trunk. She had her small arms wrapped around the willow tree for the last 30 minutes, and despite the cramping of her muscles, she refused to let go. "It's too far. I'm going to fall and break my neck, and then I won't be able to go with Mum to the museum. I must go to the museum, Dad." Her father sighed. "Hermione, if you were brave enough to climb the tree, you must be brave enough to let go." Hermione's voice was quiet. "You won't drop me?" He looked at her solemnly. "Never. Promise. Till infinity." Hermione took a deep breath, and while making sure not to look away from her father's face, she nodded once before, letting go and falling directly into his sturdy arms. Hermione jerks her head, blinking rapidly to orient herself before releasing the tree. She pushes unfurled strands away from her face, her gut clenching painfully. She sees flashes of white come up from the corner of her eyes and takes a deep breath to compose herself, eyes fixated on the towering tops of the trees below. Malfoy approaches the edge, a distance away from where she's standing, looking over the cliff. Both of his hands are in his pockets, his journal nowhere in sight. She stands awkwardly, unsure what to do or say, but feeling the unbearable itch to do something. It's bizarre not to acknowledge him coming up, especially since he isn't far enough that she can pretend not to see him. Normally, if it was an acquaintance or a stranger, she'd at least nod her hello and make small talk about the weather or the view. She can appreciate the usefulness of small talk, having become sufficiently competent at the skill with the years of practice she's endured whenever she's cornered in elevators or stopped in hallways. Truthfully, she'd do anything to cover up the deafening silence between her and the other or divert the conversation from anything intimate or rooted in war and what she'd done. But the thought of bringing up small talk with Malfoy is not only outlandish, but simply out of the question. She's practically guaranteeing herself a scorned eye roll, or worse, Malfoy's notably blank look where she'd be forced to contemplate all her life choices and determine where she went wrong to have brought her to that point. She's not even sure what would be the right thing to say considering what happened at the market and outside the hotel that very morning. Hello, Malfoy. Enjoying the view? Splendid, isn't it? Mad that we get to experience this. It almost makes you want to never go home. Also, can you please clarify the terms and limits of what you meant when you said anything? She shifts on her feet, trying to figure out the correct tactic on how to approach the shared moment of looking over the cliff. And when she turns her head and opens her mouth to make some juvenile remark about how green the trees are, she finds herself unable to form a coherent thought. She can only see the side of his face, but she's struck by the hard edges and lines that make up his profile. His long, aristocratic nose, the way his clenched jaw causes his muscles to tick, his tightly set mouth, her eyes flick to the bob of his throat, and it's that moment his eyes snap to her. She gasps immediately, scolding herself for the lack of subtlety at getting caught ogling him, and turns to face the front. Heat creeps up on her neck and burns her cheeks, and she doesn't breathe. Seconds pass, and she feels his eyes jumping across her face, but then he shifts, and she thinks maybe he's not looking anymore, and he might as well be North made into a human because, like a compass, she finds herself turning her head back towards him. Only he hasn't looked away, and she's caught once again, trapped in his own steady gaze. She feels exposed suddenly, bared to him despite the distance and layers between them. She shivers, remembering how close he was to her just a few hours ago. His face is carefully blank, and he stares at her with such indifference and rigidity that she'd think she was looking at a marble statue if it weren't for the way the breeze brushes his hair away from his face. She should probably say something to cover up the fact that he's caught her twice trying to look at him. Really, anything would be better than this. Cool intensity between them. What was it about the trees again? She can't remember a single thing to say. Not with the way he's staring back at her, waiting for her to say something idiotic. Someone calls them from behind, and Hermione breaks first. Dragging her gaze away from Malfoy, she clears her throat, wavering slightly as she moves to meet the rest of the crew packing to leave. There's a moment of pause, but then his footsteps follow after her, and Hermione exhales a shaky breath. They pull over for lunch at a restaurant on the side of the road, where they're well into Wizarding Morocco now, and they're welcomed by floating candles illuminating the restaurant in warm haze and fairies zooming around, taking orders from witches and wizards. Brooms are stacked against the side of the entrance door, and a poltergeist in a fez hat and apron takes them outside to a table large enough to accommodate them. Orders are taken, and Hermione gives a quick glance at Malfoy, seated across the table, 2 chairs down. He's as rigid as ever, spine straight and muscles taut and tense. One hand clenched in a fist and the other playing with his ring. There's an ink stain on a pad of his thumb that he's somehow missed. His eyes dart around the courtyard, alert. She wonders what he's looking for, but he must find whatever it is adequate enough that his shoulders loosen some of the tension, just a fraction really, that she wouldn't have been able to pick up if she wasn't just staring at him again. Mr. Malfoy, Tony calls out, taking out a cigar. If you don't mind indulging me for a moment, I must ask a question that has been on my mind since I met you yesterday. To fund an expedition of this size, without any qualms or limits on how the money can be spent, honestly, it's quite unheard of. I'm fascinated by what it is that you do exactly. The table quiets down, and Hermione's thankful that she finally has a valid excuse to look at him. Malfoy leans back against his chair, an air of frosty calm wrapped around him, and slides his eyes to Tony. Work, mostly. Hermione twists her mouth, and her interest piqued, and watches him closely. Other than the fact that the Malfoy family is rooted in ancestral money, she hardly knows what it is the sole heir does now in his free time. The aftermath of the war hadn't seemed to create a dent in the family's wealth, despite the notoriety associated with their name. The manor parties filled with socialites and guests from around the Wizarding Britain every Sunday only further emphasized this fact. She supposed that was the benefit of descending from old money rather than new money. Scandals and cultural rifts didn't impact the rollout of gold and assets, when it had never been dependent on societal norms and perceptions in the first place. If Malfoy wanted to spend the rest of his days on a yacht on the coast of the south of France, he very much could, with all the inherited money at his disposal. But he didn't, or at least she didn't think he did. She's sure she'd read about it in the Prophet if there were any news of him gallivanting around Europe, even if it was a snarky column noting the audacity of the heir to remain inaccessible despite how much he supposedly owed the society. Perhaps Malfoy knew that too, which could explain the parties. How fascinating, Tony remarks, giving Malfoy an exaggerated, earnest look. What kind of work do you do? He's being nosy, but damn her if she isn't relieved that someone is asking the questions that she's too much of a coward to do herself. She looks at Malfoy expectantly. His face betrays nothing. Family business. His wall is up, and it's clear he's not going to give any more. She knows he's being wary because it's a fine line between revealing himself and his family and exposing the truth of the war. His name is prominent enough, more than even Hermione's, that given enough information about the family, you could easily put everything together. Still, she can never truly help her curiosity, and her eyes snap back to Tony. She tries to telepathically encourage him not to give up, to ignore the stony look that promises repercussions, and pry a little more. It's a mistake, because Tony catches her eyes, and she realizes the exact moment where his interest drifts away from Malfoy and towards her. "And you, Miss Hermione," Tony asks, grinning, leaning closer from across the table. "You'll have to excuse my curiosity, but considering that other than the two of you, everyone is well acquainted with each other, I do believe it is necessary to get to know our scholar who does not fear dragons. But tell me, what exactly does being a scholar entail?" She squirms in her seat, unnerved by everyone's sudden eyes on her. She's aware of Malfoy shifting towards her, arms still crossed against his chest, mostly just academic work, and sometimes some research or legislation portfolios for the ministry. Hermione's an excellent writer, Amina chimes in, pride oozing from her voice. She's written at least a dozen books. 10, actually. Hermione quickly corrects and cringes at that admittance, painfully aware that it comes across as faux humility. "Ah, books," Tony exclaims cheerfully, looking at her as if she's declared she solved world hunger. "That's wonderful. What kind of books do you dabble in?" Hermione scratches her temple. While she often finds herself wanting to talk about the topics that interest her or the new revelations she stumbles across during research, she always ends up hating it when the conversation is brought up. They usually follow a conventional process where she tries to explain what she does, followed by answers to polite questions, and ending with her taking in the confused looks and swiftly changing the topic. She starts, voice faltering. All of a sudden, anything she's ever done, the title of the book she wrote, escapes her. Well, they're either academic texts like magical theory, revised texts for junior levels of comprehension, or just research on a topic that I find particularly lacking in a specific field. She's currently working on legislation. What was it again, Hermione? Amina asks, completely oblivious to the panicked look Hermione is sending her. "It's just a thing I'm doing for a friend," she hesitates, trying to determine how much information would be considered boring while also not purposely trying to be elusive and come off as rude. There have been some issues with the land that has been inhabited by henselweed for centuries, and a new parasitic plant named Asclepias snapper that has recently been introduced to the Ministry of Herbology in cahoots with a potion brewery company. So my friend Neville Longbottom reached out and asked if I could draft legislation to ensure that the henselweed are given back to their land and all eradication of the introduced plant is conducted immediately before they become extinct. Right. What exactly is a hinselweed? Tony asks, his grin faltering. Hermione clears her throat, a deep flush blooming across her face. They're plants. What do they do? The hinselweeds, well, there isn't a specific medicinal or another botanical use for the plant. They mostly grow contained to the area they are in and don't encroach on other species, unlike the snapper. Tony nods slowly. And the snapper, what is their use? Well, they were engineered by the department to have some energy properties. The pus in the leaves can be harvested and brewed in a potion that can allegedly help with providing some medicinal healing powers. However, it's a little difficult to determine if that's accurate. The experiment to determine if it really worked was biased, considering it was directly funded by the Minister of Herbology Department, and the tested cohort was not large enough to be considered scientifically significant. Oh, Hermione can practically see Tony try to puzzle and make sense of what she just said. But they're plants. Yes, they're just plants. She's achingly aware of the awkward shift around the table as Tony tries to find a way to politely change the topic without being dismissive. She opens her mouth to beat him to it, knowing it'd be better if she does it first when Malfoy speaks up. So, you're arguing a plant that has potential medicinal properties that can help several suffering people should be eradicated simply because it has outgrown a little bit? Harry snapped to him in surprise. He's looking at her bored, but there's something there behind his eyes, something different than mockery that makes her pause. A challenge of sorts. Allegedly has medicinal properties. And it was implanted in the Hinselwood territory. Also, I'm not arguing. It's a proposal. Semantics, he shrugs, effectively dismissing her, and her eyes narrow into dangerous slits. Let's say the plant does work. Why would you then not want a plant that could only provide multiple job opportunities for witches and wizards for harvesting and brewing the plant, thus providing an additional economic incentive for Wizarding Britain, but also potentially provide a medical cure for patients? Because the land they're on belongs to the Hinselwood plant, she repeats. Maybe it comes off a little haughtier than she intended. It was purposely introduced into the Hinselwood territory, which in itself is a violation. You simply cannot remove a species just because you think another species that was fundamentally made in a test tube has more value. She's right. She knows she is. If anything, she most definitely knows more than Malfoy on the topic. She spent months in preparation, speaking to many naturalist organizations and co-workers of Neville, working in conservation organization, dedicated volunteer hours to interviewing herbologists, just so she could come up with a proposal that presented an accurate reflection of the situation at hand. But in the back of her mind, she knows it's more than that. She's never been disputed about any of her work, ever. Everything she's ever worked on never gets a second glance for inaccuracies or discrepancies simply because her name was on the paper. It had nothing to do with her role in the war. It had everything to do with the fact that Hermione prided herself on ensuring everything was error-free and sufficiently backed up with research. Harry and Ron had quickly learned to never argue or dispute a fact, lest they face Hermione's whirlwind speeches, much like what was about to happen to Malfoy now if he didn't catch himself. But doesn't it, he drawls? Her incredulous stare turns into a glare. Objectively, if we were to put costs per use side by side for each plant, we can agree that the snapper has more value economically. Not everything has to be measured according to how much money can be made, Malfoy, she retorts pointedly. What the ministry did is simply wrong. Legal action must be taken before they start suffering. Is that what the plants told you, Granger? He smirks. And though his tone is borderline teasing, it only sets her off even more, not being taken serious. No, Malfoy, she snaps, frustration bubbling in her chest. She resists clenching her hand in a fist. Obviously, the plants didn't tell me that, but it's everyone's job to speak out on behalf of all species that have been silenced or otherwise voiceless. He rolls his eyes. How Gryffindor of you. What's a Gryffindor? Tony chirps in, eyes jumping between the two. And how typical Malfoy of you to assume that everything must be analyzed in transactions to ensure optimal monetary gain, Hermione scowls. All I'm saying, Granger, is that you might be right, but your justification is weak if it's solely focused on morality. Weak? She scoffs, pushing her hair away from her shoulders. She's so engrossed making sure her point is made that she not only misses the amused look that passes his face, but also the fact that Draco Malfoy thought she was right. I'll have you know that I've done my research, and it's not only immoral, which in itself is sufficient enough to protest the invasion, but it's also a violation of subsection 105, Code 2B of the Protected Magical Plant and Botanical Conservation legislation passed in 1989. He nods. That's great. You should use that. So really, Malfoy, it is illegal to introduce new species without thorough investigation and evaluation of all potential harms and adverse consequences of introducing said species. Granger. He cuts her off, his voice firm enough to finally pause her in the middle of her speech. His mouth twitches. I'm agreeing with you. Her mouth clamps shut mid-sentence. Oh. Her face flushes as she slowly looks around the table. While most of the group has broken up into their own conversation, she notes the confused look on Tony's face as he assesses the tense situation between her and Malfoy. Amina simply grins, her eyes dancing over the rim of her glass as she takes a sip and waggles her brows. Okay, right. You are. Good. Hermione straightens her fork in the table beside her plate and clears her throat, averting her gaze. That's good. I'm glad we're on the same page. It's only by the graciousness of all the gods above that must have taken pity on her that the food finally arrives and everyone is equally distracted for the remainder of lunch. She makes it a mission of hers not to look up or say another word, having thoroughly humiliated herself enough for the day. But in doing so, she misses Malfoy's eyes that don't leave her face once. They travel for the rest of the day, making occasional brief stops to stretch their legs or take breaks as needed. Hermione spent some time talking to Lena about her time on the road and the previous trip she's been on. Eventually, the vehicle becomes quiet as everyone drifts into sleep and Hermione moves from the legislative proposal to the diary. As they pass rolls of green patchy hills and palm trees, the light outside darkens and Hermione resorts to using a dimmed lumos to continue reading the diary. They reach the designated campsite after the 7th hour. Hermione gets out of the Jeep, stretching her arms above her head and rotating her neck to fix the crick she got from resting her head against the window. It's cooler outside during the night, and she's grateful that she brought a shawl and an extra sweater with her. Hermione helps Amina and Lena place their own tents with an erecto charm before going to work on her own. She adds an extension charm to her tent and furnishes it with the necessities, unpacking her bag and placing all her books neatly beside her bed. One by one, she takes out her draughts and places them next to the books, organizing them according to what is most needed for the night. Living in a tent with 2 teenage boys for 9 months has properly equipped Hermione on how to set up a tent with all the necessary essentials, but she feels a similar pang of being stuck in a closed space nevertheless. It's different this time, she tries to tell herself, as she transfigures a piece of cloth into a blanket. No more of a panicked rush, constantly looking over her shoulder or the continuous checking of wards. Still, she finds herself charming the tent to have some more room so she can breathe and cast a protection spell around the area they've stopped at for the night. She's just finished a quick wash when a string of shouts and laughter come from outside. She's exhausted by the trip, but the smell of food streaming through the tent drives her outside. Pulling on a sweater and grabbing her beaded bag, she makes her way toward the noise. A fire is made in the center with everyone gathered around in charmed chairs. A bottle of fire whiskey along with dinner is passed around. Hermione glances up at the night sky and feels the breath knocked out of her. It's unlike one she's ever seen before. White stars glitter across the stark darkness of the night like hundreds of diamonds shattered into tiny jagged stones and sprinkled haphazardly across the blacktop. Across a black backdrops. The moon is absent, but the stars radiate enough light for her to see someone at an arm's length. She's almost tempted to sit down right there and start grouping the brighter stars into constellations, as she used to do with her father. Dozens of expeditions and hours on the road, but I never get tired of it. Lena comes up from behind her. She smiles at Hermione, pulling her gray streaked hair into a bun, and I hope I never do. Hermione nods, eyes wide in awe. I've never seen them like this. Even during the Horcrux search, when Hermione spent months under the night sky, the stars weren't this clear. Wait till you get to the desert. You'll never want to go home after that. Lena wrings her arms through Hermione's and smiles, squeezing her hand. Come, let's have dinner. She joins the rest of the group as dinner is passed around. Tony lets out a resounding, "Ah, Bella!" the moment he sees her, and she tries her best not to cringe at the new nickname. Hermione sits down beside Lena, who passes her water and hands her a plate with rice and a kebab skewer. Dinner is eaten as conversations erupt around her, and Hermione can't help but glance toward the tent she'd seen Malfoy disappear inside of. She'd hoped to curl up with a book to end the night inside her tent, while the Droughts did their work, but then she catches Amina talking to Malfoy outside his tent, and Hermione decides some cool air while reading might do her good. She accios a book out of her bag, keeping an eye on the two while also trying to be subtle. He's shaking his head, lips pursed, and Amina tugs on his arm. He shakes his head firmly once more, turning to go back into his tent, but then Amina waves a hand over at the fire, saying something that Hermione can't catch, and Malfoy's eyes wave over the circle before falling directly on her. Hermione snaps her eyes back to her book and flips a page, not having read a single word. Merlin, how in the world did she ever manage to get anything done with the time turner when her lack of subtlety has become this horrendous? She hears shuffling and looks up through her lashes to see Malfoy sitting on the other side of the fire. The fire casts dancing shadows across his head, reflecting off his pale hair and creating a golden halo. Amina passes him a tie, and Hermione can't help but gape at the obscene amount of sugar he puts in his tea. Her eyes widen in horror as a fourth spoon of sugar mixes into the tea. "I think we should have some entertainment for the night," Tony exclaims suddenly, taking a swig of fire whiskey. He hands it to Malfoy, who immediately passes it to Amina, scowling. "As no one wants to hear me singing, because it's horrific, Tony." Amina looks at him pointedly. "I'd like to at least see the desert before I'm tortured by your voice." Tony waves it off. An artist is only worth its penny if it has critics." He turns eagerly towards Hermione. "How about a story from our storyteller?" "A story? Something from the book, perhaps?" Hermione looks down at the book in her hands. It's her mother's copy of Mythology, Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes by Edith Hamilton, given to Hermione on her 15th birthday. Hermione was surprised when she unwrapped her present, refusing to accept one of her mother's most read books. Each Greek myth was heavily annotated in her mother's scratchy handwriting from her time as a classical minor student at university. Little messages are scrawled into the margins with extravagant arrows joining little paragraphs and sentences together as though her mother was trying to communicate some kind of revelation within the words. The pages are stained with ambiguous fluids that Hermione thinks, depending on the story, are either tears or spilled tea. The corners are creased where her mother would mark the page they'd leave off on during their nightly read, and the spine cracked to the point it's now difficult to read the title. The state at which her mother left the book before she gifted it to Hermione would always appall her and her father. A simultaneous gasp would escape both of them whenever her mother would use her book as a coaster for tea, almost always spilling some onto the pages, or forgetting it outside on a wicker chair during a rainstorm. "A heathen," her father would proclaim, shaking his head in shock. But Hermione would never miss the subsequent unmistakable loving smile etched on his face, and the complete adoration in his eyes toward her mother. Now Hermione treasures with the same level of delicacy and vigilance as she would with her wand. She carries the book wherever she goes, shrinking it so that it fit in her pocket or bag, making sure to always tap against the cover to assure herself that she still has it. It'd been there, secured in her bag while they were searching for the Horcruxes, and there when Hagrid carried Harry's body out. She had one hand clutching Ron's hand and the other hand around her bag where her mother's book was stored as they listened to Voldemort proclaim his victory. She tightens her grip on the book and looks at Tony. "Which story would you like?" "Surprise us," he grins, settling into his chair. Hermione bites the inside of her cheek and flips to a random page. Hermione clears her throat and begins the story of Daedalus and his son Icarus. Their circle quiets as a gust of cool wind blows over the camp. The fire crackles in response and sparks fly. Malfoy's hand pauses midway to bringing the cup to his lips. The story goes on to describe the events of the sculptor who was imprisoned with his son Icarus, to the same labyrinth he created after he betrayed King Minos. Aiming to escape his prison, Daedalus sculpted a set of wings for both him and Icarus, through which they could fly out of the labyrinth. The story then transitions to Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, despite Daedalus's warning of the sun's heat melting the wax in the wings, before eventually plummeting to his death. Arguments about the moral of the story start once Hermione finishes, as she quietly closes the book and slides it back into her bag. Icarus failed to listen to his father, and thus fell to his death, Tony argues, shaking his head at something Lena has said before him. It's a convoluted way of saying, listen to your parents. He fell because he was too confident, Lena responds, stretching out her legs in the front. Icarus, a mortal, got too close to the sun, thinking he could be a god. It has nothing to do with use and everything to do with greed. Greed does not discriminate by age. It's a basic human tendency to be divine, Amina shrugs. Immortality is the basis of all self-turmoil. Everyone wants to be God once they get a glimpse into what it means to be one. A taste of the great vitality of the sun caused Icarus to forget what his father had told him. Lena nods. Even wars and crimes against humanity can be seen as an act of greed, a need to be immortalized in violence for all those involved. Hermione listens quietly, going over the story in her head and bridging her thoughts into a single coherent idea. It isn't this simple, she knows. She's seen war, the greed of man, and how it's transformed into something so ugly and palpable from his youth and then to his death. Tom Riddle's greed for immortality was indisputable. And while she also knows many of his servants shared his ideology and wished to be immortalized in the shadows of Voldemort's promises of his victory, she knows there were some followers that supported him for reasons that went beyond the basic human instinct of greed. She refuses to believe that every follower of Voldemort shared the same devotion towards violence and hatred that was rooted in greed. Can't make herself believe the dire hopelessness behind man's eventual trajectory toward evil, especially not when she testified for one sitting in front of her. It's too simple to think that Icarus fell because of his greed, Hermione interrupts. She clasps her hands together until her knuckles whiten. We're forgetting that the tragedy of Icarus started with his father. She risks a glance at Malfoy, but the mask is back on and his face is carefully made vacant. Her eyes draw to where his hands fidget with the ring on his finger, and it's the only sign she has that there's something behind the mask. She pushes forward, eyes back on her own hands. If we're saying that anyone can be Icarus, then we must also take into consideration the context that he was put in. The story before him pushed him to do what he did. Daedalus had his own faults, his own sins of pushing the boundaries of mortals with his inventions that threw him and his son into the labyrinth. And what did it matter what his father did? Hermione's eyes met Malfoy, startled by the coldness of his voice. Gone is the casual tone he'd used with her during lunch, or the sly lilt around him outside the hotel. The shadows from the fire deepen the bruises under his eyes. His hand pauses on his lap, and he stares at her with such intensity, his silver eyes glowing in the light of the fire, that Hermione squirms in her seat. Daedalus created the wings for Icarus and then showed him how to use them. They were flying together before Icarus got too close to the sun. Hermione swallows hard, her throat crushingly dry. Perhaps by warning Icarus to not get close to the sun, he planted the temptation of doing exactly that. Perhaps it was Daedalus who sealed his own son's fate. Malfoy shakes his head, looking at her with a mix of confusion and incredulity. Suddenly, she can physically feel the weight of the day's events on her shoulder, realizing it's the third time today she's arguing with Malfoy. But she believes in this strongly enough to make him understand her reasoning, is willing to face his contempt if it means he'd eventually agree. She'd studied wizarding and Muggle texts both on the psychology of nature versus nurture and the role the two play in a child's upbringing. Gone even so far as meeting a child psychologist in London before the trial, only so that she could justify that she was right to defend Malfoy. She doesn't know why it's even necessary for him to see why she did what she did, but the fury on his face after his trial flashes in her mind, and she thinks maybe it's to convince him as much as herself. Acutely aware of everyone's eyes on them and the confined silence surrounding Malfoy and her, Hermione continues. And Daedalus suffered too. He lost his son. Malfoy blinks, his eyes crumbling a moment so brief that it transforms back into his cool assessment just as quickly. He raises a challenging brow, mouth tight, and leans forward. The fire is the only thing separating them, the heat seemingly adding to the constricted space between them. Icarus made his choice and acted on his own fatal flaw. He faced his consequences, as he should. He was a child, she states simply. A child who made mistakes and suffered for it. It should be enough to end there. Why try to antagonize him? And what? He was a child, so that excuses his actions, that excuses what he did despite knowing it was wrong, knowing that he was ruining his soul beyond repair? She shakes her head. He pushed mortal boundaries, did something no man should do, and suffered for it. But he deserved his death, Granger, and all the brutality that came with it. Can you truly blame someone for death if the life they took was their own? He jerks back, inhaling sharply, and Hermione's voice softens. What even makes us think that it was greed? Why can't we excuse it as a child's mistake that drove him to it? It doesn't matter why or how it happened. In the end, Icarus got what he wanted. He became a god. Malfoy replies, his voice bitter, but then he looked up at Hermione from the fire, and her breath catches in her chest when his face transforms. She can't understand the look on him, has never seen him this way. Broken. It's so unnatural, so unlike how she's seen him carry himself in the 2 days she's been with him. It definitely doesn't go with his image in the Wizarding Society back home, because Draco Malfoy does not break down. Not in the way he supposedly broken others, like he once broke her. He got close to the sun and was immortalized for it. Malfoy's voice catches, and she hears something else. A faint thread loose between firmly set words that resemble acceptance. And the world will remember him forever, only for his sin. Hermione stands in her tent, reeling from the conversation. She left soon after the talk, leaving the remainder of the circle to take over. She just needed a moment to herself to breathe, to think. Her mind is filled with thoughts and questions, all whirling and mixed together so rapidly that she needs to physically hold on to something to process them. She feels drunk, overdosing on the drug that is Malfoy after years of withdrawal. The trip has just begun, and she worries that the remainder of the days will reflect today, arguing over trivial things, both of them unwilling to find a common ground. The entire conversation rocks everything she knows about Malfoy, which isn't much considering the years she spent not knowing him. He's always been a puzzle, always forcing Hermione to try and understand who he is, why he acted the way he did towards her during Hogwarts, what role he played in her life after that, and the manner. She spent hours, sometimes in tears, other times in frustration, trying to force pieces together where they didn't fit before, completely giving up and throwing the box away. This post-war broken Malfoy makes her want to completely upend the puzzle and start with a completely new set of pieces. Hermione takes out the book again and flips to the part where Icarus is mentioned. There, at the end of the passage, in her mother's tangled writing, is a tiny inscription. She tried to read it before, ultimately brushing it aside when she couldn't figure out what it was. But it's as though her mother is taking her hand to the page and whispering in her ear, "Look, my love, can't you see? You must understand." "Lumos," Hermione murmurs, and brings the wand close to the page. It takes her a few minutes to pull apart and then recombine the separated words into something recognizable. But she understands it immediately, having heard it before from her mother. It's an excerpt from a poem written by William Carlos Williams, Peter Bruegel's painting of the Fall of Icarus. Her chest hollows and Hermione shivers as she presses her fingers across the ink, following the curves of the letters. The words join together, and she finds clarity as she reads the poem out loud, her voice a mere whisper. In the lone tent, and her mother's phantom hand on her wrist, insignificantly off the coast, there was a splash, quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. And that is chapter 6. So you guys let me know what you think. How's it going?